Dr. Kaufman, you've already heard that he's been very generous in his support of this enterprise. He is very generous in supporting lots of forms of education and scholarship. He's endowed several professorships in the United States and in Israel. He was a longtime chairman of the Institute for International Education, which oversees the Fulbright program and does lots of things. You're chairman emeritus now, right? And lots of things having to do with academic freedom, with helping out persecuted scholars in different countries. He's been on the board of NYU, so that's just the education piece. His business career, as I mentioned before he got here, along with Al Wajnalauer, were early, probably the first two economists on Wall Street. He started at the bank. Your first job was Bank of New York Fed, right?
Industrial Bank.
Industrial Bank and then New York Fed. He was hired at Salomon Brothers by Sidney Homer, who was the preeminent expert on bonds and interest rates. And at that time, these two gentlemen were the entire research department at Salomon Brothers. By the time Dr. Kaufman retired from Salomon in the 1980s, he was overseeing about 450 researchers, and Salomon had become a major powerhouse in the bond market. Dr. Kaufman, as I did make a number of these comments before you got here about your influence on Wall Street, your projections. I want to add one thing about that, which is both of these gentlemen, so here are preeminent, you could say, technicians, able to crunch the numbers, but the way, in my observation, the way these gentlemen work was not to be quants. In fact, they're rather critical of the over-reliance of econometric modeling. And so they bring a broad perspective of looking at structural changes in financial markets, looking at broad social and economic changes, and that kind of broad gauge thinking, combined with the technical expertise, gave them the ability to project better than anybody else. I could keep going on, but I think Henry's ready to come talk. And I just want to thank you again for your support. We're delighted to have you here. Henry Kaufman.
The problem with all those introductions generally is that as you're older, your history is longer. And so there's just a little bit more to say. I want to thank Professor David Celia and the University of Maryland for arranging this forum and for all of you for being here today. The close relationship between major religions and business behavior dates back, of course, to ancient times. Much has been said and much has been written about that behavior and what it should be. Yet the impact of the various religions on business behavior has been far from perfect, and in some ways has been disappointing. Now, I hope this forum will shed more light on the gap between religions, traditions, and business behavior. And perhaps you will tell us what religions and business leaders should do to improve business and financial morality. Human accomplishments have been, I believe, very uneven. On the one hand, there are the achievements in the exact sciences. Progress in science and technology since the end of World War II, for example, has been astonishing. From moon landings to microcircuits, from modern medicine to the internet, from bioengineering to nanotechnology. We travel at speeds though that were inconceivable just a century ago. Improvements in medicine and standards of living have extended our lives. We can communicate with virtually anyone around the world with very little effort. In contrast, the performance of financial markets, where I have my experience, has been problematic in many ways. Quantitatively, of course, financial markets have exploded worldwide. The volume and the velocity of securities now traded in one day dwarfs what was traded in a full year when I and Al Wargelow began our business careers on Wall Street. Actually, from the mid-1960s through 2008, to that 2008 financial debacle, there have been 15 financial crises of various sorts in the United States itself, and many more around the world. In the United States, this series of mishaps began with the credit crunch of 1966, ran through the Penn Central Railroad failure, the failure of the Franklin National Bank, silver crisis, and 7 more crises in the 1980s, most notably the collapse of the Savings and Loan Association in that century, and capped off, of course, with the situation of long-term capital management, and now the Great Recession and setback that we've experienced in 2008. Now, a modern economy cannot flourish without a well-functioning financial system. Without effective financial intermediation, financial flows are distorted, and economic activity eventually grinds to a halt. Financial institutions and markets play a unique and crucial role between lenders and borrowers, between savers and investors. They are essential intermediaries. With so many achievements in the exact sciences, why do we lag so far behind in our financial behavior? One basic shortcoming of our periodic failure is to adhere to promises made by financial participants. For instance, in the simplest contract between a lender and a borrower, a simple relationship, the lender agrees to lend, the borrower agrees to borrow at specific terms. Most of the time, this contractual arrangement works exceedingly well. Indeed, when you sit down in a trading room of a large financial institution, you observe that a large volume of transactions are consummated at lightning speed. All participants are highly satisfied until circumstances arise that break the underlying promise. Institutions play a key role in whether or not financial promises are kept or broken. Consider a few developments. One is that markets have become highly depersonalized in the post-war period. Leading investment banks shifted from partnerships to publicly held corporations. Formerly, close personal ties between bankers, investors, borrowers, and lenders after a while loosened. New trading techniques, quantitative analytical techniques, and new credit instruments all contributed to the depersonalization of the borrower and lender relationship. These developments made it easier for market participants to really break their fiduciary responsibilities and encouraged risk-taking by debtors and creditors beyond what I would perceive as prudent levels. Now, securitization, the conversion of non-marketable assets into marketable ones, also played a key role in excess credit creation and reckless market behavior. And so has the massive growth of financial derivatives, another driver of depersonalization in finance. Although the exact sciences have advanced and improved our lives in many ways, their application in the field of finance and economics has lacked sound judgment and too often has contributed to financial turmoil. Modern quantitative and econometric techniques, for example, have infused financial participants with a new sense of confidence in their ability to forecast trends and behaviors. Yet the vast majority of these models rest on assumptions about normal, logical, and rational behavior, assumptions that do not always prevail, especially in times of stress. Markets are at times driven by hubris, elation, fear, passion, and the like, emotions that current models do not and perhaps cannot really compute. Every modern, growing economy needs a well-functioning financial system. Who then is its guardian? Where does the responsibility lie for assuring reasonable and ethical behavior? Supposedly, this duty resides with the management of financial institutions. But we know this hasn't worked very well. The key characteristic of the new financial structure that I just discussed a little bit ago, depersonalization, securitization, new credit instruments, have all motivated financial managers to lean farther and farther in the direction of risk-taking and away from their equally important role as fiduciary agents. We can see this tilt in the unprecedented number of fines. Some estimate now exceed $200 billion paid by financial institutions during the past 10 years or so for breaching their responsibilities. In the past, and even now, some prominent economists and financial participants have postulated that the ultimate guardian of the financial markets are the markets themselves. In this view, markets will self-regulate, rewarding those who act for the good with prosperity and those who act poorly with failure. That underlying hypothesis hasn't worked so well. Witness the events that led up to the Great Depression and recently to the Great Recession. Some of the most prosperous market participants, we later learned, engaged in illegal and unethical market behavior, and a great many skirted or bent the rules to some extent. The consequence of this potent and dangerous mix of structural changes that encourage greater risk-taking and widespread unethical behavior have been extremely damaging to our financial institutions and, of course, to our economy. Over time, financial turmoil has led to the formation and legislation of rules of behavior for financial markets and institutions. I believe such rules are necessary, but the correct rules. These rules are necessary. This is because without rules of behavior, the financial markets would be like a football game without a referee. Imagine what such a game would be like. But we must also ask ourselves, are formal rules imposed by regulators and courts enough? Our system can't afford, nor would anyone want, a regulator at the shoulder of every market participant. Now, what about religious codes of behavior? How can they transfer more effectively from the religious arena to the business arena? The scholars, of course, here at this conference will speak to the core of that issue. Even regulatory regimes that work can lose their power over time or be dismantled. In response to the Great Depression, our federal government passed landmark legislation that defined the role of major markets and institutions and limited the boundaries of their activities. That newly imposed structure worked quite well, at least for a while, until the generation that experienced the severity of the 1930s passed the mantle of leadership to another generation with no firsthand experience of a major financial crisis. Some even recognized that the failure of the 1930s swept away a huge amount of debt. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the private debt structure was strong and liquidity was high, an environment that encouraged market participants to take bigger risks. Throughout the post-World War II decades, the Federal Reserve emerged as the chief guardian of our financial system. But in that role, the Fed's record has been spotty. Although the central bank helped us to avoid another major depression, it failed to head off many post-World War II crises. In the case of 2008, the Fed's record was again mixed. On the one hand, it fostered conditions that contributed to the housing boom, refused to recognize or regulate the role of financial derivatives, and initially reacted to the crisis rather slowly. Ultimately, through the Feds took massive and dramatic action, and those actions did work. A consistent pattern has been the Fed's failure, I think, to recognize the impact of structural changes in financial markets on market behavior. I view the Fed's role as chief guardian of our financial system as analogous to the relationship between a parent and a child. As a guardian, the parent's role is to set standards of behavior and to hold the child to them. A parent should not play the role of a friend in his or her relationship with the child. Similarly, the central bank should define and enforce standards of behavior. Its leaders should never become folk heroes of the marketplace. I leave it to you to reflect on who among our leaders at the Fed fulfilled his role as a guardian and who were folk heroes. Moreover, the guardian of our financial system, which has been the responsibility of the Fed recently, was shifted to the Financial Stability Oversight Council under the leadership of the Secretary of the Treasury. The FSOC, as it's called, has 10 voting members, including the chairman of the Fed. The other voting constituents predominantly include the other officials of leading supervisory organizations, with their many diverse constituents and interests. It is difficult to feel confident such a group will respond with alacrity and wisdom to conditions that could lead them to appraise that another crisis is coming and that it will respond to that crisis promptly. So my comments are focused on the leaders in the business and financial world, including regulators, where the story has been less than stellar. I have suggested that institutional changes have been pushing us in the direction of more and more risk-taking, and that formal enforcement mechanisms can moderate the system only so far. Along with many distinguished business leaders, we are joined by a number of religious scholars and leaders today. As I noted at the start, religions have had a great deal to say about business and financial behavior since the early days of mankind. So let me candidly ask, where have you been lately? Where is your outrage at what has transpired? What are your thoughts and detailed prescriptions for improving our economic and financial behavior. Thank you very much.
If you have any questions or comments for Dr. Kaufman?
Why do you think religion has been silent on all of the failings of executives and the financial institutions and regulators? Do you have any theory for this?
Well, sometimes religions have been silent on earlier turmoils. This is not the only one, if you go back historically, as you may well know. Well, I hope I don't, I have probably a biased view on this. Religions as a profession have relationships. They have relationships with the rest of our society. They are involved in surviving financially. I have come across, and I'm sure we all have come across, people who somehow have the belief that they can buy their way into heaven, in that they make a significant contribution to their church, to their synagogue, and so on. They are recognized, therefore, exceedingly well from a reputational viewpoint, but then at the same time, they conduct their business affairs rather immorally. That goes on until that individual is exposed. And it is not until that time, in most instances, have I ever seen a religious institution rebel against that individual morality. It's one of our, now maybe there are occasions that this has occurred, that this rebellion, but very rarely. And if you go back historically, religions have been, years ago, decades ago, centuries ago, closely affiliated with the political leadership and supported the political leadership, monarchs, kings, queens, and so on. And that has resulted in compromises in behavior. I would, and in the current situation, I would really hope that we would have had a much better linkage in the dialogue between religion and financial leaders. Much better dialogue. Now, I'm sure if we would all here and everywhere else raise our right hand and promise to adhere to the 10 Commandments, we wouldn't have to do any of that as such. But we are what we are. But I have strongly felt for some time that the major religions have not done enough to improve the dialogue with financial markets, business people, students, and so on. Now, a remark was made here before that we're beginning to teach ethics in universities, and that's true. But as my friend here knows very well, when it comes to teaching financial and business history, this has come back only recently. Only recently. And I think one of the papers probably talks a little bit about the business schools. For a long time, the business schools themselves, in the 90s, leading up to 2008, were really developing huge finance departments to service the needs of Wall Street and financial institutions. And the Wall Street institutions did not say, what kind of a broad background does this individual have? Wall Street said, give me someone in econometrics who knows how to analyze balance sheets, who can tell me all of the quantitative aspects about derivatives. That's the individual we want. Right out of a cookie jar, in a sense. But don't tell me that he has knowledge going back historically and so on. So to some extent, business schools did not do their job at the right moment in time. Just like many of us didn't do the job at the right moment in time.
Dr. Kaufman, just if you I'm not sure that that it seems to be conflating religions with religion. So religions as institutions, the question is how do they respond, and that's disappointing. Religion has an answer for many of the types of conduct. The problem is people don't follow the religion despite how they identify themselves. The second thing I wanted to mention was that business schools, I teach at a law school. We teach legal ethics, but we teach legal ethics in an adversarial way like we teach tax. You know, I think that we don't teach I'm one of the presenters. I wrote a paper basic on why the psychology, why individuals commit misconduct, and how we can try to teach them not to. And that's what we should be focusing on, behavioral economics and social psychology, and teaching them that in the business ethics school, not the union rules of the profession, but rather the ethics and what they should anticipate and how they should prepare themselves to withstand the pressure they'll face.
I don't disagree with you at all. Okay? You moralize very well.